Welcome to Poets and Thinkers, the podcast where we explore the future of humanistic business leadership. I'm your host, Ben, and today I'm speaking with Harald Dunnink. Harald is a designer and serial co-founder who describes his philosophy as cultivating calm and designing for belonging. He founded Momkai, a Dutch design agency, working with international clients from Nike to Red Bull before pivoting to use those same brand design tools to start and support social ventures. Harald is also co-founder of the Correspondent, a member-funded journalist platform for, as he says, unbreaking news, which also became a publishing house with nearly 30 best-selling books. Most recently, though, he co-founded the School for Moral Ambition with best-selling author Rutger Bregman. Having gotten quite some attention, both ravingly positive and critical, with the School for Moral Ambition, I wanted to speak with Harald about the role design plays in driving attention for social ventures, if moral ambition is actually a matter of privilege, and how social entrepreneurs or activists can move from being called naive to achieving meaningful, real-world net positive impact. All right, let's get into the episode. And if you like the show, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this podcast. Harald, where does this podcast find you?
Close to Amsterdam.
Very good. And it looks like we're meeting you at the end of your day, judging by the light, and it's a little dark already. So to kick us off, it would be great if you could give everyone who's listening and watching an idea of who you are, what you do, and what drives you before we jump into the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, sure. No, my name is Harald Dunnink. I'm a designer, and you could say I'm a serial co-founder. So my work really centers on moral ambition and designing for belonging. So many years ago, I founded Momkai, a Dutch design firm for people who give a damn. And from that, I worked on all kinds of clients all over Europe, the US, all the way to Japan. And next to that, I co-found new initiatives. So co-founded the Correspondent with their journalism platform. I think it's over 12 years now. We are on a mission for unbreaking news. So a lot of news leaves you cynical, divided, less informed. We really want to change that. It's now one of the largest member-funded journalism platforms in the world. And most recently, co-founded the School for Moral Ambition with a bunch of other co-founders, really great people, amongst them Rutger Bregman, the best-selling author. Yeah, my work really focuses on a design philosophy of cultivating calm so that only the content can drive you to destruction.
This is already a fantastic description of why I wanted to talk to you. So we'll dive into that, but specifically the fact that you are a designer who is putting his craft to good use and with massive success, really, as you mentioned. Maybe to get started and jump into some of the work that you're doing and how this relates to the future of humanistic business leadership. You just got back from Austria, and I got a chance to watch your talk about your work and specifically also obviously how it applies to your latest venture, which is the School for Moral Ambition. So one of the things that I noted down that you said that your goal was to make doing good look as good as possible.
Yes.
So obviously, as a designer myself, that struck a nerve. I think it's also a fantastic line. So, kudos to you for that. But talk to me about that. Why is that important? Why is it especially important for, as you say, morally ambitious work, but maybe even just more generally? Why is that specifically important? Making good look as good as possible.
Well, I really feel that the real challenge of our time is making a good life and a good conscience the same path, right? We see all these wildly successful people on Instagram, but you could really doubt how they got there and over whose back. And we really want to find a way to make sure that, the smartest people out there, the most ambitious people out there are working on the biggest problems out there. And nowadays, which one of my authors in the journalism platform calls the Bermuda Triangle of talent, a lot of wonderful, talented people are being attracted by consultants, the tech industry, by big banks, into jobs that maybe don't move the needle that much. And that really, in the end of the day, are almost like a golden cage where they can't get out of. And they're not really using their talent, their skills, their creativity, their brains for these really big problems. And as we all know, there are countless, from climate change to animal welfare. So I'm really on a path to make sure that from the little bits that I can do with creativity, with showing a path, with making it accessible or making it iconic, to make sure that people get attracted to these ideas. So I think also when I was starting the agency, I had clients from Nike to Red Bull, working on really great global campaigns. But in the end, I thought like, yeah, is this really helping? This fast fashion is selling sugar water, is that helping? But I was really grateful for all the really marketing insights and branding insights
Hmm.
that I got from these corporations. There's really some wonderful people working there. And I thought like, okay, if I can use just bits of this for initiatives that really need to be seen, that need to be remembered, that need their funding to make sure that they can do the most good they can, then yeah, that's the little bit of what I can do on making doing good look good.
There's a number of connection points that I would love to draw, starting with actually what you said about making a good life, right?
Mhm.
The first ever episode that I recorded for this podcast
Yeah.
and published was with author Avi Alpert, and he wrote a book called The Good Enough Life.
Yeah.
Really kind of questioning a lot of the success narratives that are being propagated. Hearing you talk about kind of what should the goalposts be, what should the compass be for what we aspire to achieve and leave in the world is I think highly relevant, especially in the
Mhm.
times that we're currently living through. And the other reminder almost that came to my mind was there's a new book out about the founder of Patagonia,
Mhm.
and both the success but also the struggle of building a company that is almost the antithesis of a typical capitalistic corporation, and at the same
Mhm.
time clearly all the struggles, because on the one hand obviously morally these things and goals seem very noble, and
Mhm.
at the other hand they have to exist within the system, the worldwide system of maximalist capitalistic gain.
Yeah.
So I love your thoughts on using some of the tools that on the one hand sell products like Nike shoes and
Yeah.
fashion and energy drinks, and instead selling noble causes. Where does it How does it work and where does it break?
Well, of course, if you say ambition, if you we put more ambition, we put ambition on the forefront, of course. But we still believe like it's not at the cost of everything, right? So we really believe in one of our principles is really the zest for life. So we want to live full, rich, and well-rounded lives. So we're not driven by feelings of guilt, but really by sheer enthusiasm. So excited about making the world a wildly better place. And you mentioned the books. I devour all these books from like Shoe Dog of Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, or the biography of Steve Jobs. All these books were very inspiring, but I always got really sad also when I was reading them. These neglected family members. In
Yes.
the case of Steve Jobs, of course, his first daughter, Lisa,
Hmm.
who he doesn't share with that the first computer is named after her. And only really at the end, he does. And then there's a really beautiful book. I have a 3 year old daughter. There's a really beautiful book called Small Fry by Lisa
Yes.
Jobs.
Hmm.
And
It's
it
a
gives you
fantastic book.
all, yeah, it's fantastic. You have a daughter as well, right?
Yes, 10 years old. Yep.
Yeah, it's amazing to discover her perspective.
Mhm.
And that is always to me almost like a sort of compass, like how to make sure that your private life and your work life can be in balance with each other. So I believe you can be wildly ambitious, but really combine the two. So you mentioned Vienna. I just got back from Earth Talks. You don't get paid for the talk, but you get paid for going there and staying in a hotel and all that. I asked them, I really want to go with my family, the three of us. Is that okay? We come by train, and they said like, okay, we book you a bigger suite. And then it was like really this sort of gift, right? Like I could go there with my wife. She's a GP, a family doctor. So really different life,
Mhm.
and my 3 year old running around Vienna. So I could really combine then doing the talk, preparing that, sharing all these inspiring people, these activists, and combine that with sharing such an amazing trip to Vienna, one of the most beautiful cities out there, so clean, so beautiful, and yeah, really share that experience together. And then it's also a lasting memory for us as a family.
First, that's an amazing example of a very different approach to work and life. And what this brings to the forefront for me and worth discussing as we go through the conversation is an underlying redefinition of what success looks like, but also the very clear acknowledgement of it is required to know yourself well and reconcile your own humanity before you can actually act in alignment with your moral compass. And that's an ongoing piece of work, is my assumption. But it's one of those things, as you mentioned, those other books that I also certainly at the beginning of my career devoured. And at the same time, it became increasingly more clear that, a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the world are also created by mostly actually broken men that are afraid of their own humanity and actually then making that everyone else's problem. Right. And so it is something that we would have to wrestle with as we're thinking about how do we lead into a better future is as the underlying issue here that you've pointed out.
Yeah, no, very much so. And so partly why I want to make doing good look good or really share how much fun that is, it's also because it's much more collective. So it's less about me gaining all of this wealth and sort of one-upping with often imaginary others, but rather we're doing this together. Everyone has their role to play, right? And I think this is often quite overlooked also on the left, like how much fun that can be, right? So also in our visual languages, for instance, a lot of things that I design nowadays are really, I want to show that excitement. I want to show that it's actually really great doing that together. Next to that, you don't have to question your purpose. Or you are already like, when you wake up, you're like, it's more about like, there's so many things to do. I want to get through the checklist rather than, is this useful to someone else? Like my wife is a doctor. She's not questioning, is this helpful to someone? Like she's thinking about like, how can I help them? And sometimes not helping them or just sit it out can also be a helpful advice. But that really gave me like, see, and none of her friends are thinking about like, is this useful for someone? Where a lot of us in creativity, in business, in design often have that, like, is this helping the other? So that's those questions become way less if you can find.
Now, putting a different perspective on what you just said, just because I think that people listening that might either not believe that that's what you're describing is possible or have their doubts about how it kind of fits into the existing world and maybe even their own confines that they're living in. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about incentives, because to some degree, being able to put our collective well-being front and center is very, as you said, we're very social beings. It's very kind of natural to a lot of people, like us as humans, I would say. But on the flip side, at least in the Western world, we're increasingly building a society and capitalistic system that where the incentives are not aligned with that. So how do you make sense of moral ambition and putting a higher goal ahead of your own prosperity to a certain degree? How do you align that from an incentive perspective that's realistic to fit into people's lives?
Yeah, I first of all, I don't think there are contradictions, right? So you can have a prosperous life and help others, right? It's more a question often of enough. What is enough for you? Does that second house or third car really make you that happy? So if you have a clear answer for yourself, like this is the good life that I can live, and I consistently can gain or like create that income, so to say, yeah, you can have more headspace for to think like, okay, and how does it help others? And I think you have a background as a designer. You're immediately in design always thinking about how can it be useful for this other person, right? How are they interacting with that? My background is really in digital design. And often in digital design, you talk about the user experience. What does the user see? What do they feel? How do they interact? Over time, I really got fed up with this idea of user. I thought that is really about making people hooked on your product, junkies, and it's very singular. It's good to think about the experience, but I think in essence, if you create something for other people, you are thinking about how to design for belonging. Because in essence, any person wants that in the world, belong to a certain group, know your neighbors, to not really be completely isolated, right? So over time, I started to call that memberful design. So this idea of not to talk about the user experience, but to talk about the member experience. and what is meaningful for this other person, what is meaningful to be part of this group. And the group can be small or big, right? Like it doesn't have to be super abstract, really large in their life. It can be your football team, it can be your neighbors, it can be your family, but really to think about like how can I create something that feels like I belong to it. So I
Right.
think if you have that in mind, you can have a way different impact.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about, your understanding of the value you're creating and how it's the way I'm perceiving it is additive to the life of other people. Whereas most of the traditional, again, certainly Western business teachings are all about
Yeah,
extracting. How can I actually
yeah,
extract as much as possible from the individual and add it to my, bottom line, essentially.
yeah.
And so I think that lines up very well with my self understanding of and the goal that I'm trying to get to with all of these conversations is how do we create an understanding of how to get to a net positive future?
Yeah.
Because I do agree with you, it is not a zero sum game that we're in.
Mhm.
We can in fact all prosper so long as we shift the lens toward how can we actually truly add value to other people's lives rather than trying to
Yeah.
extract as much as possible from others, which is a great segue into one of your other taglines that I wrote down, which is, as you mentioned earlier, your agency called Momkai, and the tagline is for people who give a damn.
Yes.
And so, obviously, at this point, I think it's already clear that you absolutely give a damn about the work that you're doing and putting out into the world. But how did you find going about? You've worked with, as you mentioned, big corporations, international
Mhm.
corporations, but also venture funded startups. How do you feel about finding those people that give a damn, and then also those sometimes even exist within, specifically, for example, about the venture funded environment within a
Mhm.
system that might not
Yeah.
align with them giving a damn. What is your experience there, and how do you think one can build ways to kind of reconcile or even defend, your own moral ambition against those contradicting incentives or forces?
Great question. Yeah. So in my personal case, I always believe good work generates work. So you have to create the work, right? You have to build the portfolio. You have to build the examples. Over time, I learned like certain examples, if they don't come to me, I have to start them. So you start new initiatives. They become almost like a showroom model, how a car maker makes a dream version of a car. And that attracts buyers who then buy different models of that car brand. And that always inspired me. Like, I need to have those initiatives also on display because that will attract the next person. But next to that, I never wanted the agency is not a goal in itself. It's just a means to an end. It's my atelier, it's my drawing table. So the most important reason I chose it was freedom have the freedom to choose, to have the freedom to say no. So coming from this mindset of what is enough, then I know like, okay, I do the projects that are really drive me, that really get me going. And others, I have the freedom to say no to them, right? And then over time, if you have certain projects, then it will get other people on your path, right? And sometimes that is within organizations. So people are change makers within a big organization. Sometimes it's startup founders well, the person that I am one of the persons that I started a journalism platform for was one of the youngest editors in chiefs in Europe, Rob Weinberg, and he got fired for being too progressive at the newspaper. So he was kind of like, okay, this is actually a blessing in disguise.
Yeah.
And I'm often there to guide them towards a new top, right? I guide them towards the top of a new mountain, and help them, get there. So I'm often a way to find sort of clarity on your path in that
Hmm.
regard. And for instance, Rutger Bregman, one of my co-founders at the School for More Ambition, was an author at the journalism platform. And he was always the one that dreamed the biggest. So I was always naturally attracted to him. And he at some point said, like, I'm out of articles. Can't we publish a book? And then the journalism platform also became a publishing house, publishing his work. And then over time, I think maybe close to 30 books have been published. in the Netherlands and Belgium, each of them becoming bestsellers for a platform that is all about investigative journalism,
Mm-hmm.
really not top topics that you would think of as bestsellers on abuse, on all kinds of different
Yeah,
topics.
I saw that.
If you talk about you mentioned it before, what is valuable. For instance, the publishing house was actually very valuable to the journalist. Each journalist at some point wants to publish their work into a book, right? And the book is
Mm-hmm.
then also a flywheel for their thinking. It gets more attraction. But at the same time, it's also a journalistic flywheel because we are member funded. We have no ads at the journalistic platform. If the members that follow that correspondent see that she or he is really saying like, okay, I'm coming out with this book. You have so many pre-sign-ups that
Yeah,
when the books comes out, it's instantly a bestseller because the members help you to get to that point. So
right.
it's actually a sort of flywheel for this kind of journalism that normally you would say like, oh no, you only have to throw money in a pit, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it's really actually really solid. So it's meaningful on different levels also for the authors.
You know what's interesting about this is the more I listen to you speak, I'm almost reconciling in real time my understanding of ambition, which is fascinating, and it sort of brings me back to the conversation I had with Avi before we recorded and then while we recorded. It's this idea of, for the longest time, or no, most people probably think of, including myself, ambition as scale. So basically breadth of impact. But when I'm listening to you, and I think the publishing platform is a good example here, then it's no longer, maybe it has never been, but it's about depth of impact rather than breadth. That's a really interesting provocation, which I will probably even take with me after this. Like, what does ambition really mean?
Yeah, I think we often talk about the impact at the schools. So simply put, you want to make a big difference, right? But we don't really want to aim for change alone. You also really want to have transformative impact. So you must prioritize. What are the things I focus on?
Right.
And for instance, with school, we focus on the biggest, most neglected, yet fixable problems. But at the same time, we are wary of the measurability bias because not everything that counts can be counted. So you're always aware of that. But we want to really try to do our best to construct a theory of change.
And I think the measurability thing is a very good kind of segue into some of the questions I had for you around the school specifically, because in the world that you want to drive change in, you will need to be funded. And
Mhm.
typically when you are funding anything, be it self-funded or externally funded, there's always this idea of, well, what's the impact? What's the return? How do you
Yeah.
measure that? And it's paraphrasing from one of our older episodes with Joao Sevillano about the certainty syndrome. As humans, we're kind of wired to try and count everything we can to give us a sense of safety and certainty. So how do you actually deal with that? Because without it and without acknowledging that that's a reality, transformation also cannot happen, right? Because while you might already live in this world and this worldview, and for you it all makes sense, if you want to
Yeah.
bring people along, you need to speak their language and move them along. So how do you reconcile that?
Within which project that?
Just in general, how to think about measurability of impact. What do you measure? What do you not measure? Or how do you explain to people that what they might want to measure is not
Yeah, yeah.
the right thing to measure?
That's a great question. No, so partly that is for the school we developed this sort of SSS framework. So we look at problems that are sizable, that are solvable, and sorely overlooked. But to really dive into that, then we have a research team that is really great at that. I'm not a person that I'm not at that level of research capability. I'm a very intuitive person. So I
Hmm.
feel like, okay, I think, for instance, from all the authors that I worked with that were on our staff, I think like, okay, if I focus on what Rutger is saying here, I think so because I see my work really as simplify and then really amplify, right? So
Hmm.
I think his thinking, there's nothing Dutch about that. Like you should scale that up really large so as many people can find meaning in their careers. So in my case, it's often, which I think is a lot of creatives, a lot of artists will recognize that. It's sort of intuitive, gut feeling that any analytical person really doesn't like because it's not measurable and it's not really counted, and you have to trust me because this is the starting point. So I think it will get to that point, but in the beginning it feels always a bit like, yeah, that's storytelling, that's not actual fact. But the funny thing is, most of business works like that, right? It works on the projection of,
Yes.
but then it's when it's with great graphics, it's with perfect Excel sheets, but still there's a level of prediction. And so really to get into the details of that, Our World in Data is, for instance, a great way of how to measure things. I often feel like to do that right, I have to find the right people to do that.
Switching gears a little bit, I'm going to try and summarize what we've talked about so far and what I've heard, the kind of moral imperative that we should all be doing the things that are morally right and good, and that is really with a focus on adding value to people's lives. And then your description of even your work that you're doing with the agency, all the way to Unbreaking News and the School for Moral Ambition. So all of those, as I was doing some research on the work you're doing, they're all kind of counterpoints, counter narrative to the dominant business stories that are being told. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you. At the same time, as you're going through that, at least a question from me always comes up. And I've been asked that same question too, right? Running a podcast called Poets and Thinkers. I'm sure you have been called naive many times over, because in this maximalist capitalistic world, it's winner take all, right?
Yeah.
It's monopolies. That's the celebrated model of success.
Yes.
And what do you tell critics, or even maybe more important, what do you tell people that might be discouraged by being called naive or by being not taken seriously in their endeavors? Because now you have enough proof points that this approach can actually work. But not everyone has that, especially if they're starting out. And I'm also, I know a lot of students listen to the podcast, and young leaders that have maybe moral ambition. So what do you tell them? Like, what's your what's your guiding light here?
Well, I'm radically hopeful, right? Like I'm an optimist, and an optimist 9 out of 10 always gets called naive, right? Like it's I don't think this will change later in life. The negative person can always point to and then this went wrong, this went wrong. It's often a dynamic that you see very much also happening in the news, right? In the media. And I always feel like, okay, so it's not something that it's tricky. So I try to imagine now at which point one would ask that, right? Like you say, there are students listening, which is indeed a very different way of working than when you have, I do this close to 23 years or so. So you have the proof points indeed to point to that. Still in new endeavors, still you get these questions all the time. To me, what works best, maybe to better answer your question, is to find the ones that do hope, the ones that do dream. So that was, I think, the most important part for me, to attract the right people, to filter at the door. And sometimes I see the person and I feel like, oh yeah, you can be really optimistic. Let's dream this new thing into existence, which I think is the essence of a founder, right? And I always believe, if you start something, start with something with someone together. If you have another brain that you can reflect on, and it's not all happening inside your head, right? But sometimes it feels like finding your partner in life, like your loved ones, right? So it really feels like you have to find this other person that has the same drive, that has the same cares about it as much as you do. But not everyone has to care about it, because 9 out of 10 people won't care about it, right? So maybe it's less about changing the people that might be really negative into really the ones that you see a little bit of the spark, and you just turn the volume button, right? You feel like, okay, there's something, and you teach, you see that in students, right? If you see only a shiver of that spark, it's like a flame, right?
Yeah.
And I often call the people that I work with, the founders, change makers, I all call them fire starters, right? Like I'm really looking for the ones that have that little bit of spark, and I'm just there blowing wind. Like
Yes.
let's make this bigger. And I think you can do that. And then you often find like which persons like also like all the nitty gritty that come with it, the grind that's part of it. But yeah, if you see that perseverance, if you see that power in someone, those are the ones to focus on. So for me, it's similar if you go to a museum. It doesn't matter. You don't have to like all the art, right? You can hate 90%. You can be super confused in a modern art museum. It's totally okay. You don't have to pretend that I don't get half the work either. But it's really about like, it's much harder to say, but this painting really moves me, right? This one really gets me going, right? Like, I'm not sure why I'm standing in front of this really big blue painting, but it's something is speaking to me, right? So it's much more like you say, you have to attune your radar and make sure like what is this doing inside of me, and of course you can have that with a person.
Yeah, I think that's a great reframe, and having led change within large traditional old organizations and structures, it has definitely worked for me. You're looking for the fire starters, the people that get it, that believe in in wherever you want to go from a pure kind of, I guess, interhuman dynamic. I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, the one thing I wanted to ask you about in connection to that is that I'm going back a little bit to the graphic and the data that you mentioned around how more and more young people end up going into these not really fulfilling jobs. And I think there's two lines. One is, what do they value? And it starts from like the 1950s. What do they value? What do they care about? And with the jobs that they're going into. And the other line is essentially what they're valuing is what they're looking for is financial stability. Having grown up in Europe, but then also having lived in the US specifically for a decade now, I can't help but also ask the question of, is the ability to actually even start looking for something that feels aligned with your bigger moral ambitions and your moral compass, is that a luxury in at least in certain societies where financially, certainly and often not just financially, for certain groups of people, even just your physiological well-being is under threat. And how do we have to think about that? Because that's something that is very real, and I certainly see a lot of the students that I come across that are ambitious, that have a moral compass, that have even a vision for a better future. And as soon as reality starts to kick in and it's like, okay, well, we're done with school. And especially here where school is a very expensive luxury item of your life expenses, then it's like, oh, well, maybe I just should go to Goldman Sachs, or maybe I should go to McKinsey, because that just gives me the sense for, safety first and foremost. And sort of the rest gets put to the back burner until maybe midlife, and maybe you've made a lot of money and remember that you had a dream and you go back. So what's your take on that?
No, I very much recognize that. Of course, indeed, especially in the US, it's really a steep ladder to climb and to pay all the tuitions for these great schools. Well, we really see it as you really want to be avoiding climbing the wrong ladder, right? You have this famous quote at the end of your life. You've been climbing the ladder of success only to discover at the end of your life it was against the wrong wall, right? Really, especially with students, and you teach at Princeton, right? We even have a moral ambition group at Princeton.
I did see that. That's very exciting. Yeah.
It's really exciting. This student initiative that started itself. So it's really, we really applaud them, because I think, especially as a student, your 20s are really the time when you write the constitution for the rest of your life.
Right.
So really that it is a moment where you can think about like, what path will I take? And we know that these students, especially at Ivy League schools, get really fatted by all these big corporations already very early on. But I do feel like and I can imagine, right? It's tempting to see the big offers, to think about the life that you can get from that. At the same time, you have the opportunity to really look at life, right, and see the different paths to be going on. We really feel like if you are in that moment of life, what we see as more ambition is really a desire to make the world a wildly better place, which very often many students want, right? So
yes.
If you look at it, it's a combination of four things. You can combine the idealism of an activist with the ambition of an entrepreneur and the rigorous mind of a scientist and the humility of a mother. Most of those things are not things where you are yet at that moment in life.
Yes.
But we do see that you can transition into a career that has a positive impact
Mm-hmm.
while also being viewed as desirable and prestigious. And like you mentioned, right, is this possible for everyone? I do think more ambition is possible for everyone, but indeed, we're not preaching to the converted, but we are preaching to the privileged.
Mm-hmm.
People have more opportunity to do this. This is not the same for everyone, but for instance, for a long time, we talked about like, how can you change your uncle that votes for this or that politician when you think like, oh my God, this is only so self-centered. I would argue, how can you now really focus on your niece that is so smart, but that wants to work at McKinsey, or your nephew
Mm-hmm.
or your boy next door, where you feel like, oh, you are so smart, but you're throwing it away. 9 out of 10, there are so many people that burn out in their mid-30s, in their 40s, and that don't have a purpose.
Yes.
Really, and purpose, of course, this is an overused word, but to really think about like what path could that be. And we know all the stories of people within student homes that like all the other people get their offers as well, and then it becomes this sort of normal path, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's more like, and I think it's beautiful how you said it, like it contrasts certain business thinking, right? I think you always have to find what could contrast what the others are doing, especially if you're like in business school or an entrepreneur.
Right.
You're always thinking about where is the opportunity in the market, right? That's also how you should think about your own career.
Yeah, when I saw the way you're framing, also even the understanding of how entrepreneurship plays in, and that was one of the big reasons that I, took the position at Princeton, because it's our understanding of entrepreneurship is probably very different from other schools, certainly in the U.S. around entrepreneurship, and it's really coming from a very humanistic perspective of entrepreneurs being one of the biggest forces for change at societal and economic and cultural level, and that comes both with a responsibility but also with an opportunity. And I always found as a designer, and maybe it is the same for you, and I actually had written down your self-understanding of radically hopeful. I feel like with being a designer, with being an entrepreneur, there's this, and I actually dug a little bit into the research there a while ago, is this creative self-efficacy that comes with that. This almost, I guess, skill set and self-understanding that you can, in fact, affect the world around you in a way that you envision it to be. But when you look at traditional education, also when you look at traditional business environments, then that's often the thing that's the least encouraged, right? So maybe a good way for us to kind of wrap up would be a question for you, and which is hopefully then inspiring for others to kind of follow your lead. What do you think are the kind of the 2 or 3 key things that make you radically hopeful? And how can one be radically hopeful and then, turn that into action?
First of all, I think that you're not alone. So a lot of people feel alone, or am I the only one seeing that this is wrong, or am I only the only one seeing this opportunity? Well, maybe you're the first one, or you're the first one that knows that you know of, right? So I think that's one of the most powerful things to find, like find your buddy, find your collective, because then I think that's, to me, design is just a strategic tool. It can turn this conviction into collective action. So I think that's, first of all, one that would be very important to me. Let's see. Can you ask the question again?
Sure. So, what are the 2, 3 things that one can do to become radically hopeful? Be it as a young person trying to really align their life, or be it as a leader looking for purpose and trying to really make a net positive impact.
Yeah, so a second thing why I'm really hopeful is that once you see certain things happening that really arouse people, or that you feel like are not fair or anything, then you know there's an opportunity in the contrast, right? That you can find that then there's more opportunity in contrasting that with a sort of better life that you can create, right? You think it's really unfair how animals are being treated in the meat production ecosystem. Then you can think of alternatives on, I don't know, like vertical farming, anything that is like, you can find the opportunities. If you have a certain drive for that, then you can find the opportunity on the other side, right? Which is really fun to work on. If you combine it with the first one, you find a fun person to work with or more people, then you can be really hopeful in what you can do. And thirdly, I think, and that's all credits to my co-founder, Rutger Bregman, who wrote Humankind. But I think if you believe in the good in people, that will also really move you forward. So ambition for us is not about envy or resentment. It's really about inspiration and encouragement. We try to bring out the best in one another and really to find like how can we make a difference as a team, as a family, as friends, right? Because that's also very important to not neglect your friends because you're doing all the work. Like if you can combine those, so people are not a means to an end. They're not your tools, but they are always ends in themselves, right?
Yes. Yep.
So you can celebrate the heroes, you can admire people, but just take away from these people that you admire that everyone has their talent, you have yours, and just it's mostly about courage to live the life that you want to live.
And there's no better way to end this conversation than exactly here. I also will link to the books that you mentioned as well.
Yeah.
I read both Humankind and Moral Ambition. Small fry, fantastic book. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Benedict, and thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for listening to Poets and Thinkers. If you like this episode, make sure you hit follow and subscribe to get the latest episodes wherever you listen to your podcast.